Hi, my name is Joseph Parker, WBO champion of the world, and you're watching Sporting Icons.
So in 1987, when Iron Mike Tyson beat Tony Tucker to unify the only three world recognised titles at the time, which was the WBC, WBA and IBF, Showtime are saying that because in 1989 the WBO crowned its first world champion, that Mike Tyson is in fact the last undisputed heavyweight champion. Because in 1989 the WBO crowned a new champion at heavyweight. Now, their thinking is that the WBO was a recognised world title, so therefore to become undisputed when Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis, who is legitimately the last undisputed heavyweight champion by beating Evander Holyfield, because he didn't hold the WBO title, because at that time Vitaly Klitschko had the WBO, then Lennox Lewis is not an official undisputed heavyweight champion. This is Showtime's thinking. Now, of course, what they're not realising is that back then, the WBO was not a recognised world title. So, how can it be? For example, Lennox Lewis, when he fought Henry Akawande vacated his WBO world title so he can go face Lennox Lewis for the WBC. That's how unimportant the WBO was. Also, IBO, for example, when Lennox Lewis retired, when Floyd Mayweather was in his prime, Ricky Hatton and many others held the IBO world title. That was considered a pretty major title. So therefore, that would also have to be in consideration, would it not? But if you fast forward to now, we consider WBC, WBA, IBF and WBO as the four major world titles. In other words, you don't need the other titles in order to become undisputed. But by Showtime's thinking then, technically today, you need to collect virtually every belt on the planet, regardless of whether or not it's important or not, to become undisputed. So therefore, you will need to own the WBA, the WBC, the WBF, the WBO, the WBU, the IBA, the IBF and the IBO. Plus Ring Magazine and the title of Lineal to become undisputed. Who can carry all those belts? For example, Anthony Joshua taking on Joseph Parker and then going to unify, as in the winner goes to unify for undisputed against Deontay Wilder, will no longer be officially undisputed because there's many more titles out there to go collect. Even though the current holders of these other champions or of these other titles cannot fight for these other titles because they're not ranked high enough. So it's impossible. So by Showtime thinking, it's insane. For example, the new title, the SIBC title, the Sporting Icons Boxing Council, which in 10 years' time will be a huge, the number one belt in the world. But because no champion before the introduction of this held it, none of these guys were undisputed. So whoever holds that title, plus one or two others that may or may not be relevant, of course, will be the first undisputed champion. This is by Showtime thinking, right? But that's not how Undisputed works. Undisputed works by what is relevant at the time, the major, and who decides that? The fans and the fighters decide which is relevant. So today's relevancy is the WBC, the WBA, the IBF, and the WBO. The IBO, no one cares about. So you don't need that one to be undisputed. Technically, you don't need Ring Magazine. You don't need to be lineal to become undisputed because we recognise those four titles as a major one. Because everything is undisputed, is technically subjective. Technically. So, in reality, and it is a reality, we could say that Anthony Joshua versus Joseph Parker is for undisputed. Because the IBF, the Super WBA, and the WBO are titles that we recognise at heavyweight as the most legitimate titles. Because the WBC that Deontay Wilder currently holds has been technically out of commission since Vitaly Klitschko retired, as he was the last champion to have actually defended that title in worthy fights against worthy contenders for people who legitimately deserved a shot at that title. So technically, Joseph Parker and Anthony Joshua are fighting for undisputed. So we could go down that route, but that's not the reality of the route though, is it? The reality is we need WBC. So Showtime's thinking is complete hogwash. Absolute garbage. And why are they doing that? I don't know, maybe because they want to have on record that the last heavyweight champion, the last undisputed heavyweight champion, was in fact an American in Mike Tyson. It's ridiculous, really. Showtime, what are you doing? Why are you putting out this kind of garbage? I thought you guys were a reputable boxing place for people to come and get knowledge from, to show boxing, all this kind of thing. So it's just ridiculous. I mean, technically, you could say when Lennox Lewis had these three major titles, WBC, WBA, IBF, when he fought Henry Akawande, when Henry Akawande vacated it, technically he became WBO champion, right? Technically. But anyway, there's like a lot of specifics. I probably missed out a few things, or maybe got a couple of little bits here, there are wrong, but you kind of get my drift. Undisputed is only subjective. Undisputed is what the fans recognise. Undisputed is what the boxers recognise. If the boxers no longer recognise WBC, for example, Canelo refuses to fight for it. Deontay Wilder hasn't been defending it the way that it should have been defended against the best people around at that time. For example, the IBO title, George Groves, when he fought Chris Eubank Jr., technically it was a unification, but technically it wasn't, because although that belt was once a pretty big deal, George Groves refused to pay the sanction fee because he was like, I don't want that piece of trash. Anthony Joshua and Eddie Hearn are looking to potentially get rid of the IBO title because it's an extra sanctioning fee for a title that nobody really cares about. I don't know whether all this makes sense, but basically, Showtime, you're just embarrassing yourselves. It's ridiculous. How can you say, because a belt is introduced, from that moment, it becomes a legitimate world title, when all others, the IBO and the WBF and all these kind of other ones around, are not. At that stage, the WBO is technically a nothing title, a title that's not that important. You know, it's like back in the day when Muhammad Ali and all these kind of guys were winning their NABF title. Technically, you can't really be an undisputed unless at one time or another you were an American and held that title at some point in your history. It's ridiculous. I mean, Showtime are absolutely ridiculous. I don't understand. So because Lennox Lewis beat Evander Holyfield for the three major titles, WBC, WBA, IBF, by beating Evander Holyfield, because Vitaly Klitschko had the WBO, which, by the way, at that time, Vitaly Klitschko was virtually a nobody. And, you know, that title just wasn't important at that time, but because it's a relevant title now, does not mean it's a relevant title back then. Very, very simple, Showtime. You're just exposing yourselves to be absolutely insane. Or, I've got it all wrong. I suppose it depends on what side of the fence you look at, but I'm trying to look at it from a neutral, objective point of view. If you're back in the day, huge Mike Tyson fan and hated Lennox Lewis, and even to today, you continue to hate Lennox Lewis, you probably go, yeah, Showtime are right. Well, no, you're wrong too. Because back then, the WBO was not a legitimate title. It wasn't, but now it is. And in the future, one of the major 4 titles that we hold in high regard now won't be. It could be the WBC, could be the IBF, could be the WBA. Maybe the WBO will become obsolete. Maybe the IBO will take a resurgence. So, as I said, maybe the Sporting Icons Boxing Council title will be the one to hold. Maybe, technically, we could say that even with Joshua and Parker, for those two to get those 3 belts and then go for Undisputed against Deontay Wilder, if everybody kind of thought the same way, technically it's not for Undisputed unless he went and fought for the Ring magazine. And the Ring magazine would be on the line for what we consider Undisputed. So that's one. But technically, don't they have to go and beat Tyson Fury for lineal? Technically. But again, that would depend on how the boxers see it and how the fans see it, really, wouldn't it? Anyway, drop your thoughts below. Click that thumbs up, subscribe. And I hope I haven't lost you anywhere here. I kind of confused myself a little bit. Catch you on the next video.